Hi everybody, back in the locker room again. I'm going to try to do this real quick today and not be too redundant. I don't know if I can do that, but we'll give it a go. Today we're going to talk about pain and a little bit about acute pain and chronic pain. And as we always do, we're talking about this in terms of the ideas of threat and safety and what those mean to us in the world. And we tend to use the polyvagal theory and cytokine theory to explain things, and that's what I want to do. The last session we talked about brain injury, and again we weren't talking about severe brain injury. We were talking about minor brain injuries like concussions, where there's no macroscopic clear tissue trauma on imaging, but people have a level of impairment. And we also talked about concussion and how it can progress to something called CTE, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So again, an acute injury, and then potentially down the road a chronic problem. And pain is a little bit like that. It can be represented by an acute tissue injury. And it can go on to develop into a chronic pain problem that doesn't seem to go away. And what I want to point out here is that pain doesn't absolutely need to have an acute tissue injury to go on and become a chronic problem. And just like CTE looks an awful lot like neurodegenerative disorders out of the category of Alzheimer's or frontal temporal lobe dementias, but it has more stuff going on that sometimes makes it look a little bit like Parkinson's or a little bit like ALS. But you could also contemplate that we get neurodegenerative disease without ever having a concussion as well. So there are multiple factors going on, and these chronic conditions always tend to kind of fall into that biopsychosocial model that again we're trying to explain under the terms of threat and safety and polyvagal theory and cytokine theory. So let's go up to the board here and real quick, kind of how we have traditionally learned about acute pain. I'll start there, makes sense, is let's say this little guy steps on a tack, and that has triggers the tissue, the fascial tissue, the neural sensors in the foot to be activated, and they send a signal up the peripheral nerve towards the spinal cord, and we always talk about the types of nerve fibers or axons that are conducting them, and we have A fibers and C fibers, and the A's go really fast and the C's go kind of slow, and and that is part of the process, but probably not really that's significant. And then what we learned was that the cell bodies for these sensory afferents going up lie just outside of the spinal cord. It's called the dorsal root ganglia, and stuff can happen at the dorsal root ganglia where there are chemicals there, and particularly we learn about something called substance P that can tend to magnify the signal. Substance P activates a lot of things like the prostaglandins pathway, and can get nitric oxide going and create a more intense inflammatory environment right at the dorsal root ganglia. But anyway, the signal goes into the spinal cord and then starts to ascend up into the brainstem area, and there's some influences going on as it's ascending. As it comes through the brainstem, it's also weaving its way through the autonomic nervous system structures, and so you're going to see activation of our fight or flight system, our sympathetic system. The locus ceruleus here throws out some noradrenaline, and probably up here at the ventral tegmentum, we throw out a little dopamine and say, hey, wake up, there's something happening, pay attention, we got to take care of this so we don't get hurt. But this tends to activate the whole system, even up to the amygdala. There's some threat there, and then we also activate the hypothalamus and the pituitary and back down to the adrenals in case this is really something big that you know, we need to start mobilizing our resources and strategies to take care of it. But then once it gets kind of beyond that, still in the more primitive brain, the diencephalon, it goes through a relay station called the thalamus, and the thalamus takes this sensory input and kind of filters it out and pushes it off in different directions, and sometimes it, you know, it activates our emotional system a little bit. So, you know, we tend to, with acute pain, tend to have some emotional reaction to it. And then ultimately, though, the pain goes up here to this somatosensory strip up here in the front of the parietal lobe, and then it actually starts activating, you know, our action centers up here, like, okay, we got to get moving, we got to do something. But this is where, you know, we tend to sense acute pain is cognitively, the appreciation of it tends to, you know, mainly resonate up in there. Was that a burn? You know, was that like a kind of a chemical thing? Was that a sharp thing? Or was that a punch, you know, a contusion kind of thing? We start registering even what it, you know, what kind of sensation it was, and therefore what it might be, and start searching our body and our environment to figure out what's going on. So that's, you know, that's been kind of what we learned. And the other piece of this we always started learning was in this pathway we have this excitatory a chemical glutamate that sits on these NMDA receptors and AMPA receptors, but anyway, that kind of also activate the pathways. And we know that glutamate participates in ingraining pathways and also forming memories. So glutamate is part of this overall stress reaction to a painful or nociceptive stimulus. So that's kind of how we learned it, and that's probably relatively up to date where most people are being taught about acute pain. Now with chronic pain, what happens? Well, things change a little bit, and you know, the old formula was that a nociceptive or a painful stimulus started a pain circuit going, right? And then through a lot of different mechanisms, that pain circuit got sort of reinforced, got, you know, stronger. The pain circuit got more robust, and also that perhaps we also started forming some pain memories and some associations, things that we might have been doing when it happened, and so it becomes harder to extinguish the pain, and therefore this circuit just keeps firing and we can't shut it down. And that's partly true for chronic pain. The interesting thing, and a guy by the name of Vanya Apkarian demonstrated this on functional MRI, though, that the pain in chronic pain no longer registers up here in the somatosensory strip of the brain, the more sort of you know, aware, cognitive, higher level part of the brain, is that this tends to quiet down over time with chronicity, and that the brain centers kind of below that start to light up, and those tend to correlate pretty well with our emotional centers. So we started going, okay, so maybe emotions have some part in chronic pain. And as we've talked about in past sessions, that's very interesting, is that these emotional centers of the brain seem to be the same centers that represent our viscera, so our organs here, you know, the heart, the stomach, the intestines, things like that. The same centers that represent our fascia tissue, the connective tissue that weaves all over our body, and perhaps even the glial tissue somehow has some representation there, although it's all over the brain, so it's hard to comment on that. but that there might be movement away from actual, typical tissue injury and nociception and somatosensory input towards this viscerofascio-emotional pain that is what chronic pain may be. And so let's just kind of take a pause here and shift over to our cytokine stuff and kind of see how this might all fit into this description of pain pathways. So again, we're talking about a threat, tissue injury, right? But threats come in all forms. Our threat column is over here, and we'll come back to that in a second. And we tend to look at these in terms of the polyvagal states of fight, flight, freeze, faint. And we look at everything under the lens of cytokine theory. We've talked about the threat cytokines, the threogens. We've talked about how they tend to be inflammatory and nociceptive, meaning they increase pain in the body, and they're catabolic. So the threat cytokines do certain things. They activate our white blood cells, so they start an immune response. They get monocytes going, macrophages going, T cells going, a little bit B cells going, and eosinophils, and kind of create this hyper-inflammatory and activated immune response in case it's needed to go chew up some bacteria or clean up a wound or something like that. They also activate the endothelial system, so the lining of our blood vessels tend to get activated as well, and the threat cytokines activate our fascia system, and our fibroblasts get involved, and they start migrating, and they can produce their own level of pro-inflammatory cytokines, just as the endothelial cells can do that, just as all the white blood cells can pour out pro-inflammatory cytokines. And then we also talked about the glia, and that the glial cells, the astrocytes and the microglia, are very much like fibroblasts and endothelial cells and white cells. They migrate around and they throw out a lot of pro-inflammatory cytokines and activate the system. Specific to pain, we're going to deal primarily with the three kind of most well-known and most potent pro-inflammatory, nociceptive, and catabolic cytokines. Interleukin 1 beta, we should have a 1 in here. Interleukin 6, tumor necrosing factor alpha. We're not going to talk too much about interleukin 2 in chronic pain, although we know interleukin 2 can be part of this and causes illness or sickness behavior in somebody who is under attack by tissue injury, a virus, a bacteria, another person, social trauma, whatever. So anyway, back to interleukin 1 beta. So interleukin 1 beta is actually going to activate the neurons right at the cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglion. It's also going to activate the glial tissue, so the microglial cells and the astrocytes. It's going to cause an increase in substance P, which will also activate prostaglandins pathways, particularly the very inflammatory prostaglandins E2, and is responsible for hyperalgesia and allodynia. So hyperalgesia is to a painful stimuli, kind of a magnified, a super amplified response, and allodynia is actually experiencing pain when you are not being injured, or you're not experiencing what somebody would call a noxious stimuli or a tissue damaging stimuli, but you have a lot of pain with that touch. So interleukin 1 beta can do that. Interleukin 6, probably the most pro-inflammatory of the cytokines, has effects at the spinal cord, particularly through glutamate and its activity, and also is quite active in the glial tissues, getting the astrocytes and microglial cells activated. It also will increase substance P, increase prostaglandin Z2, and as I said earlier, it tends to be very active in glutamate activity and jacking that up. So it as well, you know, and these are demonstrated in animal models, but it will cause hyperalgesia and allodynia. Now, tumor necrosing factor, if interleukin 6 is the most inflammatory, tumor necrosing factor alpha is the most catabolic, probably. In fact, its original name was cachectin for essentially catabolism, tissue breakdown. But it has a very big role in the central nervous system, in activating central nervous system neurons, activating the glial cells, but it also seems to be quite active at the sympathetic ganglia, including the adrenal medulla, the adrenal gland, getting all of these systems, pain pathways kind of jacked up. It's quite inflammatory, and again, it can cause hyperalgesia and allodynia. So let's go here to these, just briefly mention that interleukin 4, interleukin 10, sometimes called tissue growth factor beta or transforming growth factor beta. These guys are anti-inflammatory, anti-pain, anti-nociception, and anabolic cytokines. And in animal models, there's been multiple demonstrations of using these that you can kind of reverse this. You can knock down the pain, you can prevent hyperalgesia, you can prevent allodynia, you can decrease inflammation, and you can prevent the catabolism or the breakdown of tissue with these cytokines. So again, this is not a real linear process, you know, boom, boom, A follows B kind of stuff. It's kind of a more massive global process, and things actually feed on each other. So if you step on a tack and you puncture some capillaries, the endothelial cells are going to be activated, the fascial tissue and the fibroblasts are going to be activated. A white cell may sort of, like a monocyte or a macrophage, might stumble onto something foreign and get activated. And then they start producing these cytokines that then create this cascade. So the cytokines themselves can stimulate more cytokines, to come out in some respect, as a cytokine then draws in more white blood cells, and those white blood cells start producing their own cytokines, and the system gets a little bit jacked up. So you get this big cascade of events, and even the tissue injury in the foot can activate the glial tissue in the brain. I mean, this goes all the way up. So you're getting this cascade, sort of global activation of a system in response to a threat. Tissue type injury. So cytokines go up, chemokines go up. CCL2 seems really interesting in this process, and also in neurodegenerative diseases. I just put it up there to remind myself there are chemokines involved in this that we don't talk about very much. Cyclooxygenase goes up, prostaglandins go up, so we're seeing more inflammation. Kinins go up, all influenced by these cytokine stimulating pathways. The kinins go up. That makes us a little bit more not only inflamed, but a little bit more histamine-y. We're a little more prone towards allergic responses. Nitric oxide goes up. Lipids go up with lipid metabolism and oxidation. So you can see not only are we having these inherent inflammatory factors going up, but between the metabolism of the lipids and the production of the nitric oxide, we're getting some oxidation stress in the body, which produces these, free radical type stuffs and can do further tissue damage, but can also help with an injury and stimulating the repair process. And we get out of all of this also some production of ATP. There's a lot of phosphorylation pathways that get activated under threat and stress. So let's go back to glutamate real quick here. We're kind of working down the nervous system instead of up this time. So glutamate, the pro-inflammatory, nociceptive, and catabolic cytokines or threat cytokines cause an increase in the production of glutamate. So glutamine can go to a bunch of different stuff. It can go to GABA, aminobutyric acid, which is kind of a calming chill thing, or it can be geared towards glutamic acid and glutamate. And glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter in our body. So the cytokines cause an increase in production of glutamate. They cause increased sensitivity of glutamate at the NMDA and the AMPA receptors. Again, probably to not only activate the central nervous system, but to cause some memory and pathway of this event so that we don't do it again. But that can be problematic when it goes on too long. Cytokines also decrease the breakdown of glutamate. They decrease the destruction of glutamate, and cytokines decrease the reuptake of glutamate back into cells. So glutamate is a neurotransmitter. It's released by cells, and it can be released by the glial cells as well as the neurons, and then it goes out and sits on a receptor, and then it can be taken back up into a cell where it's no longer active. But if you decrease the mechanics for the reuptake, it sits out there and creates if it slips off of one receptor, it's going to get back on another. So glutamate gets super jacked up in this process. And there's always this discussion in chronic pain or chronic, a lot of the chronic conditions that involve the threat response is glutamate excitotoxic, meaning if you have too much glutamate, does it overstimulate the neurons to the point where they undergo some metabolic fatigue and kind of blow up? They can't tolerate it. They're overstimulated by glutamate. And that's referred to as excitotoxicity of glutamate. And I've postulated previously that I'm suspicious that glutamate is not excitotoxic. It's excitatory, and it has a very distinct role in threat-stress response. But I suspect the thing that we're missing here is that the cytokines in and of themselves that are causing the increase in glutamate are catabolic. And so we're seeing, neuronal destruction that's mediated by the cytokines and perhaps a little bit by cortisol as well. And that glutamate may be entirely neutral. Remains to be seen. We talked about, kind of at the dorsal root ganglion, in particular substance P, which creates hyperalgesia. So it can, really amplify the pain response. So, over the next hour or so after an injury, all of a sudden it's hot and throbby and you can barely touch it, whereas at the initial insult it wasn't so bad. And then I also want to mention here that the cytokines increase opioid receptors. So we've talked about previously that my view of opioids is they're part of the stress system. They're not part of our pleasure reward system. They don't fall into the category of dopamine, but they can calm this overall system, and that they probably are really meant to get us through the severe traumas, or even running the 15 through the 26 mile of a marathon, but they very much are part of the stress response. So opioids tend to come out with threat, stress, and trauma, and so it would make sense that we would have to regulate opioid receptors in that case as well, whereas chronic opioids would cause a downregulation of those receptors. That's kind of a quick explanation of the role of cytokines. And you can see that if for some reason we are unable to reduce somebody's threat, or perhaps they have a baseline level of high threat, we may have trouble getting the cytokines to go back down after injury. A lot of times I think about post-whiplash injury where long after the tissues have technically healed, the tears, the sprains, the strains have healed, where people have really intense pain. And part of that is probably a super high activation of the threat stress response with a massive outflow of cytokines when they're rear-ended unexpectedly. Almost all of them say they were shaken, they were shocky, they may have collapsed at the accident. They didn't have much pain, but they went home, and 4 hours later they were starting to stiffen up, and the next morning they were miserable and it's not going away. That sounds like a cytokine-mediated phenomenon to me, where the cytokines make us stiff and achy all over. So this is kind of going over the acute stuff, but somebody who has a lot of chronic threats in their life is going to be susceptible to chronic pain after a tissue injury. But we've talked about earlier in this session, but in past sessions, that this chronic threat load that people can experience can also be the source of chronic pain without ever having a tissue injury. And we will search madly for some rationale about a tissue injury to explain chronic myofascial pain, when in reality a great percentage of people with myofascial pain have not had a significant tissue injury, and they simply have produced all of this pathway chronically because of the threat and stress they live under. So again, just quickly reviewing our threat column here, threats can be physical, so they can be this tissue injury, a car accident, an attack into your foot, a burn, anything like that. Also viruses, bacteria, parasites, mycelium can be threats to us. Lions, tigers, bears, persons, motor vehicles can be threats to us. Toxins can be threats. Radiation can be a threat. Opioids are a threat to us because they are part of our threat stress response, and they activate this system in addition to helping to control pain. And then what's really important is to understand in folks their spiritual threat load. Do they have suffered a lot of emotional injuries? Do they have significant sort of social illness, trauma, threats such as isolation, disenfranchisement, discrimination, injustice? Are they living in poverty? All of those things are going to jack up the threat stress response, make it a little harder to recover from a tissue injury, but and push us into chronic pain. But in and of themselves, they can push us into chronic pain, and not only that, physical illness and disease. And then in the shadow of the brains, the predictive codes that start running, probably facilitated by glutamate at some level, based on past traumas that continue to keep our threat system overactivated. Traumatic memories also probably facilitated by glutamate. And then, our thought suppressions, our emotional repressions, the things that the uncomfortable emotions we don't want to deal with, that we compartmentalize and stuff away, only to have them come back as an energy poking at us, keeping our threat system going. So, and just in terms of these memories, just one thing that is interesting in this discussion is the thing that we always learned about was the hippocampus, the medial temporal lobe, kind of a center of memories, and tends to under chronic threat stress, post-traumatic stress syndrome, or even with chronic pain, the hippocampus can shrink, and we were taught that was mediated by glutamate and cortisol and the excitotoxicity of glutamate. And we just reference back that may actually just be kind of the normal catabolic function of pro-inflammatory cytokines in the medial temporal lobes, and we can see similar phenomenon occurring up into the neocortex and the frontal lobes as well, and some other areas of the brain. So, having said all that, if we want to prevent acute pain from going on to chronic pain, we need to make sure that we are taking care of everything in this threat column to help somebody heal, or if somebody presents to us with chronic pain and we can't find a logical tissue injury for it, or some clear structural problem through all their imaging that we've done, or an inflammatory explanation, although most of the inflammatory explanations fall into these categories as well, then we for sure need to dig deep here to figure out what's going on in somebody. And then we have, kind of all of our traditional interventions that haven't really changed much from treating COVID to treating neurodegenerative disease to treating neck and back pain to now, contemplating treating chronic pain conditions. And I'm not going to review all of these things again today. They're well discussed in past sessions. But if you have somebody who isn't demonstrating a normal kind of resolution of an acute tissue injury, they seem to be slipping into chronicity, it's well worth reviewing the role that all of these things can play. With that, I think we can probably conclude that acute pain is a structural phenomenon, but chronic pain is a biopsychosocial problem, and it may have an acute tissue injury that precedes it, but it may not, and therefore it can look very much like our chronic neurodegenerative processes, or the chronic neck and back spine deformity processes. They all are kind of part of the same soup that we have to do a better job of managing. Thanks.